Hey, welcome back. I'm so glad you're still with us on this journey. Hopefully since the last video, you've maybe learned a new tree or two and that you've been paying a little bit more attention to the birds. And if you haven't got around to it yet, that's totally fine. There's lots of time to do this stuff. So today's video is all about reading the story of nature, reading it in the tracks, in the signs, and even taking it in through the sounds as they spread out across the landscape. Now I should say that tracks didn't always interest me when I first started getting into this stuff. I was naturally a plant person. I started off wanting to know how to grow food, that transitioned into wanting to know how to ID wild plants, and then eventually learning how to forage them for food. That transitioned to wanting to know how to make herbal medicine, into mushroom foraging, and now today I even grow mushrooms as well. So that was kind of my journey. But as my relationship with the plant started to deepen and grow, I realized that I could only take it so far without starting to build relationships with the birds, with the trees, with the animals, with the tracks. They're all part of this greater ecology. And that's what I like to think of what is truly holistic, you know, being part of the whole. And that you can't reach the full potential of your relationship with any one of those things without being aware and having some relationship with all of it. So let me share an example of what I mean by that. And hopefully through the teachings of this story, you'll start to be able to see how you could apply this to your experiences in the outdoors.
So I've suddenly teleported into the mountains, or maybe just into my office downstairs. This is actually a story that happened to me going back probably almost 10, 15 years ago, and I was hiking down a sandy trail by myself one day. And looking at the slide here, I'm the picture on the left there, so the blueprints, and on the right are some green prints, and those represent a deer, and this is what the track pattern actually looked like on the ground. So if you can imagine, I'm walking down the trail this one day, and I'm cruising in what we call a diagonal walk, which means my feet kind of alternate like this, and you get this diagonal pattern. Now, interesting enough, when deer, when canines, so like wolves, coyotes, foxes, and when cats or felines walk, they actually make that same diagonal pattern as humans. But the difference with a human, it's just a back foot in each step. With the deer and the canines and the felines, there's a back foot and a front foot with each of those marks. The back foot basically superimposes on top of the front foot, and sometimes they're offset just a little bit, but they still make that same diagonal pattern, so we call this diagonal walk. So on this day, I'm walking down the trail, and I see this deer in the distance, but what happened on this day is the deer stopped, and she stomps her foot, and then lets out this big wheeze and snort kind of like call. And then she stomps and stomps, and she lets out another wheeze. And she stomps, and she does it again. And I was kind of like caught off guard, like, whoa, what the heck is this deer doing? I've never experienced this. Like, usually they just run away. So that goes on for who knows how long. And then finally the deer takes off. And I'm like, man, that was really interesting. I wonder what's happening here. Now, I was really getting into tracking at this time. And I had this other thought of being like, well, if I was another person walking up the trail, would I have actually been able to piece this story together? And this is just one part of the story. So this is where it kind of gets fun. So I decided to go over there and look at her tracks. And this is what you would notice. Now, I want you to imagine it's not me in the stereo. I'm a random person, or maybe this is you now. And you're walking down the trail and you're following the deer pattern. So you're on the right side of the screen, you're following the deer in a diagonal walk. And suddenly you see two prints side by side. So remember, before they were going diagonal, now there's two side by side. As a tracker, this tells you that something happened and there's a reason for it. And this is when the tracks start to come to life and when the story starts to be told. Once you understand these basic patterns, you can start finding the meaning in them. So what commonly happens with this T-step, you can imagine the animal's walking. If it stops for any period of time, it's more comfortable to bring those 2 feet side by side. And we call this a T-step. So even if you weren't there, if you were following this deer, you could say, oh, look, the deer just stopped here. And then you can look close at the tracks and try and figure out, well, which way was her head facing when she stopped? Now, I can't get into that in this video. That's too advanced. But we do get into that in some of my more in-depth programs if you're interested in learning more. But you can actually tell which way the animal's head faced. And in this situation, imagine you know how to do that. You look down and like, okay, the deer is looking straight ahead. So now you go walking straight ahead. And what do you find? Oh, look, the deer was actually looking at a person because the person was walking the diagonal and then they brought both feet side by side as well. They did a T-step as well. And now you start to form this like theory or this hypothesis like, oh, I wonder, or I bet that at the exact same time the deer's 2 feet stepped side by side, it was probably when the person did it. The two sets of tracks, they look about the same age and they both clearly stopped. They're both clearly looking at each other. Maybe there's a correlation and you're starting to piece the story together. Now, the next thing you would have found on this track if you were tracking it, is there's actually a whole clump of tracks all at the end, and they're way deeper than the ones you're falling in. So now you know that deer is stomping her foot. You now know the emotional state the deer was in. The deer is agitated and it's feeling defensive. Okay, there's something going on here. And why is it doing that? Why didn't the deer just run away? Because usually deer would just run. She's feeling the need to actually hold ground for some reason. So as a tracker, you're going to start exploring and crisscrossing the landscape to try and find more information. Now, what happened just after she stomped is, remember, she ran away, and the pattern changes from that diagonal walk to this pattern where you have kind of the 2 front feet staggered and then the 2 back side by side, and then there's a big space where the deer is actually airbound, or airbound, going through the air. We call that a bound pattern. So I started actually following this for real, trying to piece together why the heck she did the stomping thing. And sure enough, when I get into a little bit off to the side of the trail, I find these tiny little red tracks, and it's actually a baby deer fawn. And the deer fawn is doing the same thing. She's walking in this diagonal walk, but you'll notice she does a T-step as well. So the deer fawn actually stopped. And now as a tracker, I say, oh, cool. I wonder if when that first deer snorted, that's when the baby deer actually stopped, put her head up, lifted up her ears, and listened to her mom. Said, oh, mom's telling me something. I better run to safety. And this is actually what happened. So that little fawn, she bounded away, and then where that red circle is, she actually laid down on the ground, and we called that a bed. And shortly after, and then the mom ran around and walked back, and then I actually found where the mom came up to the bed, and the 2 of them were side by side. And I'm gonna guess that when that fawn laid down in that bed was about the same time that the mom decided to run. So this was really fascinating for me that day, because what I realized is, even though I witnessed the first part of the story, I was now able to get an answer to my question. Well, why did she stomp and wheeze? Oh, it's because she had a fawn with her. She was trying to protect her. But the real light bulb moment for me was when I realized that that entire story was written on the land, and that even if I wasn't there, all the details were there. And that really, when you start to learn these patterns in the tracks, those tracks become alive. They become living stories as these animals interact with the landscape, interact with the weather, interact with other species, and they can teach us so much about the world around us that we would never get a glimpse into if we didn't know how to track. Now, what I'm going to do right now is teach you 4 basic patterns, and there's way more than 4, and it can get quite complicated, but the basic 4 are kind of like the ABCs of the alphabet of starting to read the story in the tracks. So let's look at these. Oh, I forgot about this slide here. So I talked about her laying down. If you don't know what a deer bed looked like, here's a couple of pictures of a deer bed in the snow. If you look at that bottom picture there, you can actually see the long lines where her legs are down on and she's laying on top of them. So there's the bottom bed there, and then there's 2 at the top there where the deer have been laying on the ground long enough that it's actually melted the snow. Often when you go and look at deer beds, if you ever find one of these, get down on your hands and knees, because it's really common to find little deer hairs in the beds. So these are the 4 patterns right here, and this is the downloadable worksheet. It's actually a scavenger hunt that I've set up for you. So I want to throw out the challenge for you to go out for a wander, whether you do it in the city or whether you do it in the forest, it doesn't really matter, but to go and see if you can't find these 4 different common patterns. So you can get this from the email I sent you. You can print off this print off this worksheet and actually bring it out into the field, take it as a scavenger hunt, try and find these 4 patterns. So let's talk about those 4 patterns quick. So this first pattern here is the one we already talked about. This is the diagonal walk. And this is the common way that our ungulates, so our ungulates are our deer, our moose, buffalo, horses, things like that move. Our felines are our cats, so everything from a domestic cat to like a mountain lion to a lynx or a bobcat, as well as our canines, so coyotes, wolves, foxes, and dogs. Walk in this diagonal pattern, and you have the rear foot land on top of the front. Now, if you see an animal doing this, it's walking. If the length between the tracks gets wider, but the pattern stays the same, then it probably means it's trotting, which is more like a jog. If an animal is doing this, though, you know that they're probably not running for their life, they're probably not chasing after something, they're walking, moving pretty normally, especially if it's one of these species that we just talked about. Now, the 2x2 walk, this is the common pattern of the raccoon. And you'll notice on the picture there, what happens is you have a back foot and a front foot landing side by side. So the back is not landing on top of the front like in the last one, it's landing beside it, and those are alternating each one. So this is a walk pattern as well, but this is a raccoon walking. To give you an example of how you might put together a story here, imagine you're following a raccoon track and you see it in this 2x2 walk, but suddenly the raccoon track actually switches to this diagonal walk pattern. What do you think that means? It probably means that the raccoon is actually stalking now. If it's gonna move really slow and try and sneak up on something or sneak away from something, it might actually move into that diagonal pattern because it's more efficient, it's more sneaky. So if you saw a raccoon switch from this 2x2 into a stalk, you know the raccoon is doing something interesting right now. See, that's how the story starts to come out. The next pattern is what we call a lope, and this is a common pattern of the weasels, particularly the smaller weasels, like the mink and the marten and the fisher and the long-tail weasel, the short-tail weasel. And what you have this is you have a set of 4 tracks, and then there's a big space as it goes airbound, and then a set of 4. So you can see that in the picture down below there. It almost looks like there's just 2 tracks there, but it's actually because they're superimposed on top of each other, and there's a space. So this is a common one that you find in things like minks. And this is actually a mink track right here. This is just a slightly different variation. And with this one, you see a single track and then 2 side by side and a single. So you can see that in the picture there. The little red carabiner shows the 2 side by side, and then you have one out in front, one back behind. So that is the pattern of a mink in this lope. And then the last one here, and these are the 4 most common ones, is what we call a bound. And this is the ones that are often used by things like rabbits and mice, as well as squirrels, and they're running really fast. So the front 2 feet come down, and then the back 2 feet, if you can imagine, the front come down, the backs actually go past them, and then the animal's airbound. So the back feet are actually the ones that are further forward than the front feet there. But let's go back to, let's take our, we'll stick with the raccoon, because we talked about if the raccoon switched to a diagonal walk, it might mean it's stalking, trying to sneak up on something or sneak away. But what if you were following the raccoon and it's in that 2x2 walk, and suddenly the raccoon is doing this bound pattern? Because raccoons will do this bound pattern. That means the raccoon is probably running away from something. So maybe it's being chased by a predator, maybe it heard a person coming. So as a tracker, you can start to piece together what's actually happening and maybe get a glimpse of the emotional state of this animal based on being able to see these patterns. So again, you can go and download from the email this scavenger hunt and go out into the woods, start to look for these basic patterns out there, and that'll start to help you begin to read the story of nature written in the tracks.
So I hope you enjoyed that lesson about reading the story of the deer in the tracks on the ground there, and that you started to at least grasp those patterns a little bit. One of your next steps is going to be to print out the PDF that came with the email that I sent you with the tracker scavenger hunt that has those 4 patterns on it. So you can bring that outdoors with you and start to find those patterns out in nature. That's the first step. It's kind of like the ABCs of making this all come together and reading that story of nature. And when you go out to actually do this and start having some success and seeing some of those patterns, I hope you start to really feel the possibility of this and how that can really start to influence the experiences that you're having and change the way that you move through the outdoor world. So I want to do one last activity before we wrap up here. And I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for a second if you feel comfortable. If you don't want to close your eyes, don't worry about that part. But really the most important part here is I just want you to imagine yourself right now. You could be, let's say, on a nice, beautiful little pond where there's some ice and a fresh snow on it. Or maybe you're sitting on a beach with some nice, fresh sand, and you see a set of tracks going across it. Now, up until now, if you haven't done a lot of this, you might just see a string of tracks and say, oh, I wonder who that is. But imagine that you've actually spent the time learning these patterns that we talk about in today's scavenger hunt and activity. And now when you look at that string of tracks, you can actually see the animal moving in them. You can tell that it's walking in a diagonal walk pattern. And then all of a sudden it stops and it looks over its shoulder, and you can picture it smelling or being aware of something. And then you can feel, because it started to jump and run after that, oh, this animal got worked up. Now you're understanding its emotional state, not because you saw the animal, but because you saw the animal in the track pattern. So this might feel like a lot to digest right now, and being able to look at a string of tracks and get that much detail might feel like a long ways off for you, but the scavenger hunt really does start to teach you the ABCs, as I said. So go back to that email that I sent and download that scavenger hunt, print it out, and I challenge you to head out, whether it's by yourself, with some friends, or even with your kids, and see if you can find some of those 4 basic patterns out in nature. And just to give you a couple of tips where to go look for them, again, you can do this anywhere. So if you live in a big city, remember that you can find these in the raccoons, you can find these in the domestic cats, you can find these in the squirrels, you can find them in the Norway rats for that matter. all of them make these patterns, so you can start learning even if you're in an urban setting. Now, if you can get into a wooded area, especially after a fresh snow, that's a perfect time to go look at these tracks, because then you might find deer, coyotes, rabbits, other things of that nature. Another great place to look in urban settings is underneath bridges if there's a creek going through there. So often there's some mud or sand along the edge. So you might have to do a little bit of searching to find where you actually can get clear tracks. But once you find those spots with those couple of tips, see how many of those patterns you can start to find. And hopefully, with time, you'll start to actually see the animals moving. Now, before you go and we wrap up here, this was the last kind of official video in this mini-series. But if you've been really enjoying this journey, if you're feeling inspired, and maybe you even feel like a deep calling inside, like this just feels right to you. You know you want to increase your awareness, you want to know what you don't know, you want to increase your knowledge and your connection with the land, I want to suggest a few next steps to help you go deeper. So I'll send you out more details about how to join that community and those teachings in the next email. For now though, it's time to download that PDF and head out into the land and do some tracking. Okay, cheers, take care.